that this is being recorded. But you're all muted in any case. If you have questions, please put those into the chat. We will be getting to those towards the end of today's presentation. We're going to try to keep it to a nice tight hour and end around 1 p.m. Some of the things that you're going to hear today is really just about the successes and the lessons learned, things that we wished we'd done differently in the last year plus, working on workforce housing in and around Newberg to serve its employers, and really with a focus on innovation. But the takeaway that I'm hoping is that you learn from some of our lessons over the last year plus, and also some of the best practices that have really been working, so that you can take those to your communities or the communities that you are working in. And of course, key to all of that work are my two co-presenters today. And I'm going to start with a little bit of gratitude. We like to do that with the Missing Middle Housing Fund. You already heard me thank Amy, but I want to have a huge thanks to both Abisha and Elise. The Missing Middle Housing Fund is a 501c3 nonprofit that is obsessed with housing underproduction statewide. But we can't really do what we do, bringing technical innovators and developers and funky finance to different communities without local boots on the ground. And that really started with SEDCOR, who represents Polk, Marion, and Yamhill County in Oregon, and my close friend and now board member, Abisha Stone, who has long worked in and around in various capacities in the mid and upper Willamette Valley. And so we're going to hear from her first, but a second piece of gratitude to Elise. If you don't have employers that relentlessly show up, it's a much harder lift to do workforce housing. Workforce is literally the people that power your economy, that care for your sick, that teach your children, that work in the public and private sector, making goods and driving the vitality of the places we call home. And so Elise shows up in many different ways to make that happen in her home in Newberg. And so a big thanks before we even begin to both Abisha and Elise for their partnership and for spending an hour with us today on a Monday. So without further ado, the best person to tell the story of how we began is Abisha, because she's been really central and core to the convening, the facilitating, and the gathering of both technical partners and the employers that her organization serves. Abisha?
Yeah. Thank you, Nate, and thanks, Amy, for setting up this presentation and for all of you for joining us. So again, I'm Abisha Stone with SEDCOR. Again, that stands for Strategic Economic Development Corporation. And as Nate said, we are an entity that serves Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties. And I want to stress the point that we are not a housing organization. We are not a child care organization. We support economic development in our region through traded sector business development. What that really means, kind of boots on the ground, is that we make sure that our industry partners have access to the resources that are available to them. In 2018, we contracted for business retention expansion services with Yamhill County. And that was how we really started getting engaged in supporting the businesses in industry-driven solutions. And these conversations, I mean, what I'm here to talk about today is the Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium. And that is essentially a group of employers in the city of Newberg. And these conversations started in 2019 when one of those employers approached me and said, you know, Abisha, we're struggling with recruiting and retaining employees. And we believe that fundamentally it's around housing challenges. And we think others have the same issue. Are you willing to convene a group of us to discuss that? And I said, well, yeah, let's do that. Let's come together. And admittedly, I was a little bit surprised to see how wide felt this issue was. And to give you some examples, one of our partners, George Fox University, told us that they were struggling recruiting new educators and professors. They would actually, seek out folks from around the country, and they would make offers of employment. Those folks would accept the offer and eagerly come out to the region looking for housing, and not be able to find housing and ultimately turn down the offer because either, again, they couldn't find the housing, or what they were finding, they were just priced out of the market. Now remember, we're having these conversations in 2019, so this is pre-pandemic, right? Those issues were not created during the pandemic, but they were certainly highlighted and exacerbated during that time. We also had a story from the Newberg School District who said, we had 5 snow day closures in 2017 for the school district, and we had absolutely no snow anywhere in our district. But it's because so many of our teachers live outside of our district, we couldn't get them here. And so the more conversations I had with employers, the more I realized that this really was an issue. We met once or twice in 2019, and then, as you all know, early 2020, the pandemic hit, and everyone got really busy, focused on addressing the pandemic. But they still wanted to meet. So consistently, quarterly, the Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium was convening. And at this time, it was comprised of ADEC, which is the largest private employer in the city of Newberg. They are a dental component and operatory manufacturer. Friendsview, which is a retirement community. Again, the Newberg School District, George Fox University, Providence Healthcare. We'll hear from Elise a little bit later. And the city of Newberg. We got them engaged right away, and they continued to be a part of this convening group. So as we were meeting through the pandemic, we were bringing in partners from the state, trying to identify whether there were any resources for this group. And at the time, there really weren't, right? It was more a matter of saying, hey, if you guys come up with a joint solution for addressing workforce housing, let us know. Give us a heads up, we'll share it with other folks. I think the biggest lesson that we learned early on was that we needed to define the issue that we were trying to address. So whenever we told folks that we were trying to support, the development of affordable housing, of course, they thought that we were talking about capital A subsidized affordable housing for those making less than 60 or 80% of the area median income, or AMI. And that's not what this group was focused on. They were focused on what they were calling then workforce housing, right? We want to support folks that are working and have decent jobs and maybe just are still priced out of the market, especially now we're coming on the backside. We're 2020, 2021, housing prices are skyrocketing. But when we mentioned to our partners at the state that we were trying to address workforce housing, they said, well, why are you playing in the realm of transient farm worker housing? And we said, no, we're not doing that either. We're just trying to support the development of middle housing, right? What is that? Just the people in the middle, the people that don't qualify for subsidized housing, but those that are priced out of the conventional market. And we kind of landed on this middle housing terminology, which of course our friends at the Missing Middle Housing Fund identified much sooner than we had. So we had all of these partners at the table that are pretty influential in their community, large employers, landowners, had resources. And we started playing around with the idea of investing in a joint housing development. What if we all put in some resources, secured a certain number of units for our own employees, and decided to move forward with that? That could be a real solution. Then we started learning about fair labor laws and fair housing laws, and it became very intimidating for these partners. But they still wanted to do something and said, okay, we're going to keep pushing forward and we're going to do something together. Well, in 2022, we got the attention of one of our local state representatives, Representative Anna Scharf. And I can't see the list of who's on the call, but I believe either Representative Scharf or someone from her office is joining us. And I'd like to thank them again for recognizing that this group of employers had by this time been convening now for 3 years, working diligently on creating a joint investment plan. And Representative Scharf said, I think the state can show up to help you. And she assisted us in applying for some funding through the Christmas tree bill process, and we were able to secure $3 million. to help ignite the work that this group was trying to do. That funding really became a catalyst to help move us forward. You know, it kind of became almost a time-bound motivator as well, which was really helpful. So here we are in 2022, we've secured this funding. We have these employers that are consistently coming to the table. The city of Newberg is actively working to help us identify land and process to move things forward. But we still found ourselves stuck because this group of employers, if you just, you know, I just kind of shared with you the work they do, none of them invest in residential housing developments. Uh, None of them have a history of building housing for their employees. Now, we have some mixed history of housing employees, but it was kind of a, you know, Friendsview Retirement Community had a couple of units that needed to be remodeled. And in order to secure employees, they were able to put them in some of those units for a short period of time, just trying to come up with their own solutions. But this isn't a core competency of theirs, and it's certainly not a core competency of ours at SEDCOR. So we knew that we needed some additional help, and we decided to bring in the Missing Middle Housing Fund, who provided expertise in workforce housing and were able to help us align a vision for the investment of this $3 million. The first thing our friend Nate on the call here did was say, instead of you guys trying to figure out how to do this on your own, what if you put together an RFP and brought in local developers and innovators and asked them what they would do, right? What would they do to best utilize these funds that you have? What would they do to best utilize the resource that is the partnership of these employers in the consortium? Of course, he also brought technical expertise, which we didn't have, and said, in addition to putting out an RFP, how about we host an event, a housing event, right? And we bring together leaders and these folks, and we inspire creativity and partnership. And that's exactly what we did. So the Missing Middle Housing Fund put together an RFP for us. They managed that process. They identified innovators throughout the state and some from beyond the state who were able to come in and attended the housing summit as well. And ultimately, we chose a couple of projects that we wanted to invest in. Now, I'm going to, take a little step back here because, again, one of the things that the consortium members would say was, if this problem hasn't yet been solved by developers and policymakers, what makes us think that we can figure it out? Like, how can we do it? How can we do it better? And so as Nate was telling us, here's a process, engage them in this way. Let's make this a collective process to move things forward. It really resonated with this group, right? And they were kind of like, phew, we don't have to try to figure it out. There's folks that have been working on this, and we can come alongside them and share the resources that we do have without having to try to learn everything, right? So ultimately, what we did was, after learning from the developers and the innovators about what they really needed in order to inspire the development of what is missing middle housing in our communities, we decided to launch a fund. And Nate will talk a little bit more about that fund later. And ultimately, kind of the last step was to move the projects forward, which also Nate will talk about. But it really was this group of employers coming together saying, hey, I have a problem. Hey, I also have the same problem. Working with each other consistently for now, it's been 5 years, right? That this group has been convening regularly, engaging local policymakers, leaders, and legislators, and having the city at the table the whole time was of huge value. That got us to move forward to the next step. And I'm really excited that we have one of those employers and also local community leaders on the phone, Elise Yarnell Holloman. So I'm going to throw it over to her now to share a bit about her experience working with the consortium and the work that both Providence and the city of Newberg are doing. I think she might need to be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me? Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with each of you today. And I just want to start out by saying that none of this is possible. And I really, really mean that, to have a consortium of large employers at the table without SEDCOR and Abisha herself. Nathan has been a huge piece of that, with missing middle housing. But what SEDCOR has done for us, in our community of Newberg, has been able to convene large, medium-sized employers around a shared issue that is crippling their industry. And for us, housing has been one of the main issues that we've been trying to solve even pre-COVID. And so bringing SEDCOR to the table, they just are going to have so many more connections and economic development tools in their pocket to help guide those conversations, especially when you're trying to do public and private funding together, which always gets interesting. So a little bit about me. I've been on the Newberg City Council since 2018, so just about 6 years now. And I've been a part of 3 different councils. The first was much more old school, and I learned a lot, and really learned a lot about just how to govern in that council. And then the second council may be a little bit more progressive, and that's where affordable housing conversations really got started. And with our new council, although we are all pretty conservative across the board, all of us understand, and I think that I'll speak for myself, but I think that the council has taken action to back this up, that housing is one of the core tenets to livability and the health of our community. And we really want to do everything we can for our Newberg residents to live here, work here, spend their money here, not need to travel to Sherwood or Tigard to work and spend their money there, but rather work in Newberg, live in Newberg, and spend their dollars in our local economy. So while it may seem like not our problem as an employer to solve, it absolutely is our problem. And I can, with my Providence hat on here, and I'll be clear when I'm speaking of which, but as a Providence senior leader, over the last 5 years, I moved to Newberg in 2016, and it was much more common for our staff, more front end workforce, to be able to afford a home or an apartment, condo for rent within Newberg. And really, I would say within since COVID really began, the last 4 years, our staff have to move further and further out. So whether they're moving to Dayton or Amity or Willamina or Sheridan, some down into Monmouth now, Mount Angel, even Malala, really getting workforce pushed out of city limits of Newberg. And we saw this coming a few years back. Obviously, a lot of us on this call know many of the barriers, and that it's not the developer's fault that they have to build for a certain price. And so there are different things we can do, both city council to support our developers and incentivize affordable housing projects. We've tried a few of those. One of that's on the screen is working to reduce our service development charges, which was a long time coming, and has a carve out for daycare. And so really trying to put our money where our mouth is, and to what matters to the livability of Newberg residents. And even if we attract in higher paying jobs, we also need to be mindful that a lot of these working families need access to daycare. So it all I would say touches one another. In terms of the project at Providence, that project has been, and sadly, the longer I'm in this world of housing, the more failed projects I see that looked so pretty and could have been so successful, but needed that last $10,000 to $15,000 of funding at the end. And we've had multiple iterations at Providence. We have a piece of property that's on 99 and Providence Drive. And if Doug Rux, I think Doug Rux, I saw him sign up for this call. If Doug Rux is on the call, he's gonna takes us back. But I think it was 2016 when we started talking about potentially doing cottage clusters or tiny homes on our property, being adjacent to the hospital and being able to really support medically fragile folks coming out of discharge into safe housing so that we aren't discharging to the street. That ended up not panning out for really what were SDC's infrastructure build that was required. And we didn't know how long the project would be there. And it didn't seem like the best long-term use of dollars, of capital dollars. But since then, we had the opportunity to partner with YCAP and purchase the Motel 6 through Project Turnkey with OCF out in McMinnville. And then now we're back to really trying to get something in Newberg, because Newberg really is where the need is for our larger employers, to try to get a lot of these working individuals and families home. So we have in the works right now, and I would say we're in planning stages. I talked to our chief exec before this of what is okay to say right now, because I don't want to get people's hopes up and then not deliver. But the goal really being this mixed income model. And it seems to be that the mixed income models, diversifying income, really does help the sustainability of the project once open. So we can come up with all the capital and loaning and all of that, but then the ongoing sustaining of the operations seems to be a limiting factor for many organizations we're speaking to. So we are looking at 2 buildings, one of which will be affordable housing, could be slated towards workforce. We're looking at 60 AMI. And that's about 48 units, and then 48 to 60. And then the other building being a mixture of permanent supportive housing. So those would be folks that are being discharged from the hospital, that really aren't complex enough to make it into a long-term facility, but really aren't safe to go home either. And so just providing that level of additional wrap support for patients to really try to help them recover and not be readmitted. And then there will be a small portion of beds for respite. And I was very involved with a different hat, Community Wellness Collective, where we ran and operated a low barrier shelter in Newberg in partnership with the church for 3.5 years, and served on average 35 Newberg residents a night. And really just seeing the downstream effect of when, housing supply for working families is not available. Oftentimes when those individuals don't have the supports that I had, they end up being on the street. And so we've been really proud to try to connect all the dots that, our houseless population are oftentimes, and in our case, 55% of our houseless population are working 40-hour-a-week jobs. And so where are they supposed to go? And so I'm really, really hopeful that this project with Providence, which is also a partnership with Edlin & Co. and Catholic Charities of Oregon and Community Wellness Collective, can be one that is here for 50 years and can really try to build out that working families and individuals that are working, or individuals that really just need that recuperative recovery space before they're really ready to live fully independently. So I would say the really, really important pieces we've learned along the way are stakeholders. So knowing your organizational magic, what do you bring to the table? What can you bring to the table? Just like Nathan was saying at the start of this conversation, whether that's land, whether that's capital, whether that's operating of a project. Maybe you do have housing projects that you operate and run. If you have services you want to bring into the project, all are really necessary. We started having the service provider conversation a little late into the conversation, but now it's great. But it turned out that our partners at the table didn't want to run the operation. And so just as the grants you're applying for, whether they're through OHCS or whether they're, more privately funded through OCF or middle missing housing, just understanding who you really need to team up with. And I would say, teaming up with people that have aligned values is super important. You can get in deep in a conversation on a project and realize that, what you're trying to achieve may be slightly different than the other organizations. So really searching out those organizations that seem to be trying to solve the same problem in the same way as you is really important and will save a lot of time long term. So the hope is in the next few years that there will be 2 buildings at that property, and it will be a true partnership amongst multiple organizations, and the invitation is still out there. I don't think that this by any means this is a one and done exclusive project. I think we're really open to if there was another employer that wanted to come into the conversation, we would be more than excited to have that conversation with them.
Thanks, Elise. And thank you, Abisha. It's important to understand why all this work is happening. And I think Elise articulated it well, and so did Abisha. As housing prices go up in your community, housing gets less and less accessible to the people doing the work in your cities and towns. And we know that as they drive further and further and further to their jobs, they stop taking those jobs. They quit. They go get a different job. So I'm going to keep us moving here. Just a quick intro to us. We are a 501c3 statewide nonprofit. Again, I'm Nate Wildfire. I run the Missing Middle Housing Fund. Shout out to both Abisha and Jeff Gauss, who's on the call, 2 of my board members. But we really believe that without quality housing that your employees can afford, you don't reach potential in your communities, the humans, the people, and the actual city or town itself. The way that we try to address our housing underproduction crisis statewide, which depending on who's counting at any given moment is around 140,000 units of housing, is you find the people who are already doing it. We have innovation everywhere we look in Oregon. These are developers that have been doing it for many, many years. These are general contractors. These are startups coming out of some of our education institutions. The challenge is to find them and connect them, because the economics of workforce housing, that middle housing that we almost never build, is hard. It's really hard to make projects pencil. The people that live in those homes generally make too much money to qualify for big A affordable housing, the stuff that we always hear about cities or HUD subsidizing, and they don't make enough money to actually be able to afford the new stuff being built in your community. So you have to find those doers and stack their innovations on top of each other, the good ideas. Elise brought up that they're going to build housing on their land. So you have to have employers in the driver's seat that are actually driving this type of change in your community. And then try to make housing, instead of like the scary conversation in your community, the thing that riles everyone up, the thing that drives pride in your community. It's an asset, not a burden. These are, here's our secret recipe, right? For how we actually start to try to work with employers to solve their workforce housing problem. First, you need something like a SEDCOR. We've done some work in Bend. That was the Chamber of Commerce. We're doing work in Boardman right now. It's the city of Boardman and the city manager who's leading that work there. We've started to work in a couple different counties now around the state, and the county is the thing that's driving the conversation. It doesn't quite matter who, as long as you have someone. Like the Missing Middle Housing Fund, or, I saw Elliot from Humankind Homes on this call. I saw Philip Higgins from Newberg. they're the doers, right? They're the people bringing innovation and horsepower, but they're probably not the same folks that align employers in every city around Oregon. That's a SEDCOR, right? That's someone who they can pick up the phone and get the CEOs or the superintendents or the city manager to show up. And when they show up, it has to be relentlessly, over and over and over. The employers in Newberg are special because they started in 2019 and they never stopped coming. And so now their land, their political clout, their ability to bring down state and foundation resources is so instrumental in the change in those communities. If the employers are just sort of like, yeah, we need workforce housing, go solve it, thanks, it doesn't work. It doesn't happen. They don't know all the time how they can impact workforce housing creation in their communities. They just know they need it. And that brings us to the third secret ingredient, which I call bait. How do the innovators of the world, whether they're in Oregon or the funders of the world, or the great folks doing workforce training to create a better general contractor base in your community, why will they show up to Newberg? Why will they show up to Boardman? Why will they show up to Coos Bay or Tillamook or Missoula, Montana? Shout out to Annie on the call. They show up because there's something that enables them to test their innovation out. Sometimes it's money. It can be grant funds. It can be a loan. It can be investment. It can be equity. Sometimes it's land. That land can be bought, given away, leased, ground leased. It can partner with the development. Sometimes the employers own it. Sometimes the city owns it. Red tape scissors, I like to talk about that a lot because if you have your regulatory agencies at the table, they're a different kind of bait. Time is money, and if they're showing up relentlessly as an employer and stakeholder, they can make things go faster. And of course, any developer on the call knows that if you've got a big fish ready to say, we will pre-lease XYZ units ahead of time, the cost of your commercial loans generally decreases. And then the fourth ingredient is the innovators, right? And so the Missing Middle Housing Fund runs a network of over 100 innovators that show up looking for ways to pilot what they do. So what's actually happening? You know, here we are, we're almost a half hour, we're past a half hour into this. What are we actually doing? So Abhisha spoke a lot about the $3 million that were raised through the help of Representative Scharf. That $3 million really came because all of the employers and SEDCOR could say with a unified voice, we have a problem, please help. And the dollars came. And so those dollars largely became the way that we got hired to work in Newberg. It's the way that we're giving out grants, we're giving out loans, potentially equity investments. Humankind Homes was one of the runners up in our competition, our RFP that we put out there. And for a variety of reasons, some of our projects haven't quite gotten where we thought they might get as fast as we thought they would get there. But Humankind Homes is very excited to build housing out of geopolymer-based building blocks. So think of it as a concrete, low-carbon material that you can build in a factory and then try to pilot on site. You know, fire resistant, you can build it with maybe 6 lower skilled folks in 6 weeks versus the months and months that it takes to build a home, and crucially, build it for less capital. Well, Humankind Homes needs some help doing their research and development and certifying and testing their product. So we just gave them a loan to do that work to build their pilot projects in Newberg. So that actually happened. Elliot's on the call. Hi, Elliot. Don't spend it all in one place. But we're driving that forward. Philip Higgins is on the call, partnering with CD Redding Construction. They were one of the winners of our RFP, and they're driving a project forward to build workforce housing units in Newberg. And so we've been working with them back and forth. And Philip, I hope we're going to get across the finish line soon. But that's a project that we're still very passionate about to build workforce housing in Newberg with some kind of funky financing. We also just recently gave a grant out of that same fund to Urban Form. Urban Form is a tech startup that digitizes zoning codes and then uses artificial intelligence to radically reduce the time to review zoning permit applications. The average time in Yamhill County right now is about 18 weeks. Not every city has dedicated planning staff. I saw the COG on the call, I think McCrae, thanks for being here. The COG actually does a lot of the planning review. The city of Newberg itself does a lot of the planning review for other communities in Yamhill County. And functionally, a lot of what comes through the door is incorrect zoning permit applications. Urban Form simplifies and optimizes that process so that the very first time you get a zoning application, it's better. It has less errors. And so it reduces the time for the entire system to work through zoning permit review. So they are now going to work with 7 different cities in Yamhill County, including Newberg, to build a much, much better user interface for citizens, city employees, and developers to better access zoning permits. So that's another thing that this Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium just invested in. You'll see below Friendsview and George Fox University are noted. We are working directly with those 2 employers, just like we worked with Elise, or we are working with Elise, to try to do workforce housing projects on their land. And this is very much to serve their employees, but also other employees. That's a little different in our experience working across the state, that employers very directly are engaged in trying to solve that funky equation where the math doesn't work to build workforce housing in their communities. The land's a big part. And then the mayor, I wanted to call out Bill Rossiker. Bill was a pretty significant skeptic early on of our work, but has very quickly become a champion of building workforce housing in Newberg. He was one of the spearheads, Elise will tell you, of the SDC reduction project. Bill is also one of the spearheads of organizing, with SEDCOR's help, the other mayors of Yamhill County to do the Urban Form zoning project. And now he's working with some of the local engaged landowners and business people in Newberg to build yet another workforce development housing project. So we are huge fans of Mayor Bill Rossiker, even though he was very, very much a skeptic at first. He is now honestly quite one of the biggest drivers of the change in Newberg. We like to talk a lot about innovation around these 4 quadrants. A lot of people would say it's that darn red tape. That's the reason we can't build workforce housing. And they're kind of right, but they're only partly right. The money doesn't work, even if you solve all of the regulatory barriers. Councilwoman Elise can only do so much to make workforce housing happen in her community of Newberg. There are other factors at play. There's really no such thing in the financing and funding bucket as a workforce or middle housing loan. There really aren't commercially available loans to cater to that income band in your communities, which is one of the reasons we had to create our own. We had to create a pre-development loan fund to actually try to spur innovation and development in Newberg specifically. Any general contractor will tell you, I could double production tomorrow if I could find enough humans to work in construction. The average age of a construction worker in Oregon is now in the late 50s. And so we don't have enough people who go through skilled training programs to become contractors, to become subcontractors, to become plumbers, drywall experts, to actually work with HVAC. We don't have enough. If the governor is successful in doubling housing production over the next decade, we're going to be short 13,000 hammer swingers. So there's got to be something that drives change in that quadrant too. And then again, we have some of our innovators on the call right now who are innovating the stuff we make houses out of, the design, the industrial process, the supply chain. Well, nobody's really interested in funding those because it's really, really risky. Usually nobody knows how to actually build it because we don't train them to do this type of industrialized construction in school. And last, most of it's illegal. It doesn't even pass permitting or some sort of different type of regulatory environment. So you have to solve this across the board in your communities. You can't just focus on one. There's no silver bullet. There might be silver buckshot. So you got to try a lot, and not all of it will work. But the fear of failure is not a good reason to just never get started. So here's our big lessons. Number one, you need boots on the ground. You need an ABASHA. You need a SEDCOR that can actually gather the employers and keep them together for the long term. You need someone to acknowledge we have a problem. It is preventing our economy from thriving. Let's get to work. You got to be deliberate about who is invited to the table. Some of your bigger employers will not relentlessly stay engaged. That's okay, but they probably shouldn't be driving the change then. You need the public sector at the table, for sure. You need some of the largest cultural stakeholders in your community to believe in this change. So you got to be very thoughtful about who's coming, and you really, really need that technical expertise. If you are only inviting the folks who have been there the whole time, you're not really going to have a whole lot of change. And that's hard for a lot of communities in Oregon to say, yeah, come on in, crazy entrepreneur from Spokane. Sure thing. Someone from Klamath Falls, come teach us how to do stuff in Central Oregon. That's a hard conversation, but it's the way that best practices spread across geographies. You really need relationships because housing, I regret to tell you, does not happen fast. So you need to build some trust across all of the folks working. I already mentioned the city leaders and how they are actual heroes in this process right now. You need bait. You got to have dollars. You got to have land. You've got to have some folks willing to put their money where their mouth is. You need the expertise. Sometimes that's from outside, but don't forget about the expertise that's already in your community. You have excellent developers, excellent landowners who know how to get stuff done. Lean on them. Invite them to that table. Let them drive. And then you got to have backup plans because I'm here to tell you, innovation sometimes goes real sideways. And so you've got to think outside the box, but also be ready to pivot quickly. That's not a great strength, no offense, Elise, of government, but you need folks at the table early and often to acknowledge that some of this is going to not work. And just because it's not working doesn't mean you should stop trying. You should just pivot and go to the next thing. Speed is important here. Communities do not reach their full potential without workforce housing. And so you got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And then I always really like to talk about the coalition of the enthusiastic. I work across the state. Everywhere needs middle income housing. But I don't have time to just teach every community. So I try to go with my team where folks are pumped about change, where they are excited about thinking outside the box, where they are excited about big tent solutions. It's never going to work if there's only a couple people driving the change. You really need this coalition of the enthusiastic to make stuff happen. And so we show up again and again and again to the places who are very heartily saying, we've got a problem. We want to go quick. We want to embrace outside the box thinking, and we have done the work to gather the people who make decisions in our community. So We're going to pause here and get to some questions. But I'm just going to maybe say one last piece of this. Part of the best part of my job is that innovation's everywhere I look, and it doesn't really care about politics. It doesn't really care about what city we work in. And frankly, it doesn't care what the driving industries in your communities are. Innovation and good ideas cross those boundaries, and everyone acknowledges that we need more workforce housing. This isn't like a blue-red rural urban problem. It's everywhere. So I hope that's helpful to some folks, but let's see if we have any questions. Philip, thanks for chiming in. I'm pumped you're excited about your project with the 66 units of workforce housing. Infrastructure continues to be a huge challenge across the state. I'm going to give you two examples. We're doing some work with some folks at the coast. And in the coast, it's common to have water systems that are restricted in their capacity, as well as sewer and wastewater infrastructure. And so and sometimes that can add up to like 50K per unit, right? Which just kills a project. So how we deal with that is a huge piece of innovation. And if you've got a best practice in your community that's working for maybe the funding, for maybe the how, please reach out to us and let us know. We've been working with some folks called Alpha Ledger out of California, for instance, who only just do bonding for infrastructure in smaller rural places. And I'd love to connect you with them if you've not been connected so far. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. Second example, Santiam Canyon. Santiam Canyon is also part of SEDCOR's territory, but we've been working with the Freris Brothers Lumber and manufactured wood there, who is having challenges hiring and retaining folks to do cross-laminated timber. We saw a big splash this past week when the airport reopened its brand new terminal with this. If you haven't been there, I just was there. I flew on Wednesday or Friday. It was gorgeous, but it's one of the largest mass timber roofs in the world. And we're very proud that that was manufactured in Oregon with the help of Freris Brothers. But they can't hire the people they need because there's nowhere to live in Santiam Canyon. Santiam Canyon has very limited water and sewer infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure. So it is a very clear barrier that we will need to solve if we're going to ramp up their ability to build workforce housing in Santiam Canyon. Okay. Brandy, could you share how you worked through some of the fair labor and fair housing issues? Abhisha, you brought that up.
Yes.
Maybe we can start with you and I can chime in after.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Brandy. And I wouldn't say that it's been entirely worked through, but I would say that that's been the biggest, one of the biggest sort of like regulatory concerns of these employers was, hey, I don't do housing. I educate our youth, or we build dental operatories. We don't know that we have the desire or the bandwidth to get good at this, right? Like, how do we invest? It's not just investing now in a housing structure. Now it's investing in that ongoing management of what that might look like. So one of the options that we pursued when we were looking at a joint building investment of the employers was to have somebody else take over all of that. And for us, a really good option was the local housing authority, who lots of folks don't know, at least the one in our region, does have the ability to manage that type of a housing structure by contract. So they then would be the ones who would take on managing who qualified for the housing, for how long they qualified for it, what the selection process might be. So that takes the burden off of the employer on the fair labor side. And then, of course, they manage housing ongoing, right? So how do they make sure that they are taking care of the facility and providing all of the resources that somebody who's renting would need? And of course, that's the fair housing side. So as we were looking at that investment, the decision was to contract all of that out so that these partners didn't have to become good at that.
Also, I'll just share with you a resource that we know about and have worked with in the state. There's a land trust in Central Oregon. I think I saw Linda from Redmond. These are folks in your backyard. Rooted Homes Community Land Trust, which used to be called COR, K-O-R. Rooted Homes has done a ton of work on this exact issue with the workforce housing they build on their land trust owned land. So for instance, one of the big employers they were working with was Mount Bachelor Ski Resort. And Mount Bachelor Ski Resort was shutting down in the height of winter because it turns out their lift operators couldn't afford to live in Bend and Sun River. Kind of makes sense. And so they partnered with the Community Land Trust, Rooted Homes, to actually build workforce housing. And the way that they were working through some of the fair housing law issues was they created a lottery, in essence, for folks of a certain income to see if they would be the ones that would qualify to purchase and rent homes. I don't know the full details, but every time someone asks, I send them to Rooted Homes, and they seem to get the answers they need. So Brandy, I would send you their way as well, and I'd be happy to connect you via email after the call if that's helpful.
Nate, do you mind if I jump in and share some specifics on the city SDC conversation as well? I know I see some partners from cities and counties. I also see some of my economic development colleagues, Renata, McCrae, Annie, and Colleen. I'm glad that you guys are here. And oftentimes we talk about, like, what are the specifics, right? Like, what are those boots on the ground things? So like I said, the city of Newberg had been at the table the whole time. And as we were saying, gosh, what could the city do to support those 4 quadrants, right? And support this consortium. And as the mayor was really getting excited about this work, one of his frustrations was like, gosh, this regulation is managed by the state. We don't have any control over that. We can't get a UGB expansion, and that would help to solve some of these problems, right? Sort of the state level stuff. So I kept saying, we have to focus on what you have control and authority over. What are the things that the city actually has control and authority over? And of course, the system development charge structure is one of those things. So with, the work of city council, right, and Elise being a part of that city council, they took themselves to task and said, what could we do not only to address this as a barrier, but also to inspire the development of middle housing? So what they did was created a tiered structure for their SDCs. They recognized that by design, smaller buildings, smaller housing units are inherently more affordable, right, by design, and that they hadn't had duplexes, quadplexes, just sort of smaller units being developed in the city in a very long time. It's more of a mini mansion approach out in wine country here. So what they did to inspire that was restructured it so that if you're building a home under, I think it's 1,000 square feet, Elise, correct me if I'm wrong here, then you're going to be charged 25% of the traditional SDC structure. If you're building a home over 2,000 square feet, then you're paying 125% of that SDC structure. And then there's 1 or 2 steps in between. So it's a tiered approach, right? The larger the building, the more system development charges you're going to be applied. And part of that rationale was because in order to put in the infrastructure to serve a home, it's the same price regardless of how big the home is. And they felt that should be adjusted. And that was meaningful. We also had a similar conversation around childcare, just to put that plug out there, because they're often going hand in hand as we're talking about joint service investments for housing. Was they said, hey, let's put a moratorium on SDCs for childcare. Some of you know that they did that out in Central Oregon during the pandemic, which we thought was brilliant. And they said, we're not losing any money here because nobody's applying for them anyway, because the system development charges are such an obstacle. So we're not losing money. Let's just stop charging it and try to inspire the development of childcare.
Thanks, Abisha. We've time for a couple last questions if you want to get those in. I would, I see folks from across the state. I've talked with a lot of you. I guess I would maybe share this as sort of a close to close. There are so many things we have not figured out yet. But the process by which you engage with your local economic development conveners and facilitators, your coalition of the enthusiastic, your employers, which have land, clout, money, need, very urgent need, that process works. We're very confident in that. That is a way to get folks to the table who have not been before. You're not really waiting around for some sort of giant grant to materialize from the sky. You can get working on that tomorrow. And then, you know, like, again, I'm so glad that some of our innovators are on this call. They just want to show the world that their way of changing how housing happens is possible and works. What they sometimes lack is a place to do it, in a coalition of enthusiastic funders, landowners, red tape scissor cutters, right? To say, we're going to take a chance on this new zoning software, on this new material to build homes, on this new design, on this new way to train our kids to want to work with their hands. You know, I'll age myself here, but I graduated high school in 2000. And in 2000, I was the last class at my giant high school of 2,500 people to ever have shop class. It got canceled after that. I have 4 younger brothers. Not a single one of them got the opportunity to work in a shop. And so, like, that's part of this equation too, is that we've disincentivized working with your hands. So it's not always just the material, the funding, the red tape. It's like, how do we actually get the workforce to build the units that Providence Hospital needs to effectively serve Newberg, for instance, right? I just, yesterday was on the phone, or not yesterday, Friday, was on the phone with some folks from the federal CHIPS office. These are the folks that are investing billions of dollars in semiconductor plants, but they have no plan about where the humans that actually will build the plants will live, and then where the people that will work in those plants, and that's like thousands, are actually going to live. So there's a break on our economy. There's a buffer, and it's housing. It's the biggest barrier to hiring and retaining now in the state of Oregon. And the only way we're going to figure out how to solve it is with everyone's help. So I think we're at time. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I really appreciate it. Please follow up with us. Our website's easy to find. It's the longest URL ever. Thank you to Abisha and Elise for being my co-presenters and bringing your expertise and passion and presence to this process. Thank you, Amy, for organizing the whole thing. We're going to sign off. Take care, everybody.